Hello and welcome to Talking Books. I'm Jill de Villiers. A movie called The Wild Geese was released in 1978. It starred Richard Burton as a character based on the real-life adventurer, mercenary and businessman Colonel Mike Hoare. In real life, Hoare led a team of 300 wild geese across the Congo in the 60s to crush a communist rebellion, rescuing 2,000 nuns and priests and beating Cuba's Che Guevara, and became a legend. His actions in the Congo brought him the nickname Mad Mike, but this was just one of his many exploits. Joining me today is his son Chris Hoare, who wrote the biography Mad Mike Hoare, the Legend. Welcome, Chris, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Jill.
So, your father, tell me about this Mad Mike. Where did this nickname come from?
Quite frankly, most people I've ever met have described him as the sanest man they ever met in their life. But, you know, and if his name had been Ben, he wouldn't have been called Mad Ben. He would have been called Bad Ben or something like that. I think when people do unusual things, we always describe them as mad. It really means they're bold, they're adventurous, a little bit unusual. And I think that's what applies to Mike.
Mm-hmm. In March this year, just a few days ago, he turned 100 years old.
Yes.
And you said to me that that is proof of a life lived dangerously can be of benefit.
Yes, that was his philosophy. You get more out of life by living dangerously. It was the big thing in the 50s, and he grabbed it with both hands and became an adventurer. But nevertheless, after going through many, many scrapes and taking a bullet across the forehead, he still lived to be 100.
Now, let's start a little bit earlier. And he grew up in Ireland. He's from Ireland, and he fought in the Second World War.
Yes.
Before he came to South Africa. Just tell me a little bit about that.
Yes, he was born into an Irish family, but not in Ireland, as is commonly thought. He was born in Calcutta, India, where his father was a river pilot. He was a master mariner, the father. And then at the age of 8, Mike was sent to school in England, finished his schooling there, and then pretty soon after that, in fact, he had just started his articles to become a chartered accountant. The Second World War broke out, and he signed up and always described it as the happiest day of his life.
So that's where he got the taste for the military from, fighting in the war.
Yes, but it's even more interesting than that, because when he was at school, in the holidays, he was put in the care of a sergeant who had been in the British Army and who had fought in the Boer War in South Africa. So during Mike's school holidays, he was infused with a military fervor and a love for Africa and adventurous heart too.
Throughout the book, many people refer to him as such a gentleman, very erudite, very educated, very military, very British in his military attitude.
Yes, that's right. Most people describe him as an officer and a gentleman. You see, between the ages of about 20 and 27, he was in the British Army. He rose up through the ranks very quickly. He was a major by the time he was finished. And so by that time, he had espoused all the values that a British Army officer has. He was correct, right-wing, punctual, but above all, good manners were the thing that was paramount for him.
And then he came out of the war and became a chartered accountant again, and that was a rather boring life, wasn't it?
That's right. He finished his articles after the war, qualified as a chartered accountant, and then I was born by then, and my mother and father and I came to Durban, and Mike went back into chartered accountancy, but he wasn't cut out for that. It was too boring for him.
Okay, and then he started a whole bunch of adventures. So
Yes.
his adventurous spirit, he did amazing things like ride a motorbike up Africa from Cape to Cairo.
Yes, that's correct. And the following year in 54, from Mombasa to Lobito, the last part on the Benguela Railway. So these were minor adventures, but pretty much nobody was doing that kind of thing.
Well, I wouldn't regard that as a minor adventure. I think in those days, driving on a motorbike all the way up Africa,
Yes,
quite
yes.
a major adventure.
Yes, yes.
Okay, but then the opportunity came for him to become a mercenary. And that was at the time when Africa was changing, that it was changing from colonization, from it's the time of the Harold Macmillan's Winds of Change speech.
Exactly, yes. Yes, you may remember that the Congo became independent from Belgium. Very soon Katanga, which was the richest province, broke away. They were met with opposition from the United Nations and others and called for gendarmes. Mike signed up, but by the time he got there, he was front line. He was a captain there, and to be honest, it was a bit of a sideshow, Katanga, and he and all the English-speaking mercenaries were expelled after a few months in June of '61.
And then he got called back in '64.
Yes, well, '64 was a whole different thing. The communist rebels had taken over 2/3 of the country, and America could see it was going to fall into the hands of the Russians. And the interesting thing is, if the Russians had got the Congo, according to the American view, they would have then had control of pretty well all the world's supply of cobalt, which is used in missile systems, weapon systems, and above all, the space race. So America would have lost the space race. So they couldn't afford to do that.
Mm-hmm. But what was the attitude of the world towards mercenaries at that stage? It was not very favorable.
Yes, I think what happened initially was French and Belgian mercenaries went in, and they were, according to Mike, slovenly and unsoldierly, and didn't dress properly in a British way, and they were soon dubbed les affreux, which means the terrible ones. And that's why Mike, when he got there, tried to counter that and rather shrewdly named his men the Wild Geese, which had a romantic air about it and was good, clean stuff.
And what is the Wild Geese based on?
The Wild Geese originally were Irish soldiers who were beaten by the British. I'm not so strong on this, but I think it was in about 1700, and then they refused to join the British Army, and they preferred to fight in continental armies and as mercenaries. And so Mike had heard about this as a child, apparently, and so he killed two birds with one stone, getting away from les affreux and giving them an Irish name, which was also romantic and so on.
So while he was in the Congo, he was fighting for the government against the rebels.
That's correct.
And the rest of Africa's leaders were not very impressed with the fact that white soldiers were fighting, or white mercenaries were fighting in this war.
Yes, that is correct. Mike always said that there was nothing wrong with mercenary soldiering so long as it was done for an elected government. And that was the case in the Congo in '64 and '65. But yes, the rest of Africa didn't agree. And the mercenaries took a lot of flack at a higher level. But nevertheless, they carried on, and they did drive the communists out.
So tell me about Stanleyville. That was a huge battle.
Yes, that was the first major objective. It was a major city, the rebel stronghold, a column lined up. I think it took them 2 months to get there. They fought their way through rebel territory up to Stanleyville. At the same moment, Belgian paratroopers dropped on the airport and came into town from that side, and the mercenaries were coming in from this side. Unfortunately, the rebels, who had been holding a lot of people hostage, marched them into town, and there was a massacre.
So 27 people were shot.
That's right, dead and who knows how many injured.
But a few thousand hostages.
I think there were about 300 white hostages, but it was actually much worse than that, because in the 3 months prior to that, the local populace were being massacred, and always for no reason at all. If you were a teacher and wore glasses, you were
so
toast.
The educated class was definitely anybody, children. You write about children of 8 years old shot and killed because they were going to school.
Because they were going to school, and killed in the most horrendous manner.
So let's move on to a completely different one, and this is now much later. This is in '81, and November 81 and the Seychelles,
Yes.
which is now where the Congo was a huge success for Mike.
Yes.
The Seychelles was the opposite.
I think the word you're looking for is catastrophe. Yes, it was.
So,
There were a lot of problems in mounting this coup. They were trying to change the government in the Seychelles. But if you ask me, the fundamental cause of the failure was not enough money. You can't do that kind of thing on $200,000 or $300,000 in those days. Mike's original plan called for $5 million, but nobody had that kind of money. And in fact, Mike himself funded a certain amount of that coup attempt because he believed so strongly that the world did not need a socialist government in the Seychelles, which was so well placed to monitor events in the Indian Ocean.
So unfortunately it went wrong within the first day of getting there, and they were then charged for hijacking a plane. It's a very long story, so I think
Yes.
people will have to read the book to understand exactly
Yes.
what happened there. But the long and the short of it is that they were flown back to South Africa and they were arrested.
That is correct. Yes, because they didn't have money, excuse me, they had to take the weapons with them. And the weapon was found, all hell broke loose. And to cut a long story short, they jumped on this Air India Boeing 707, which was bound for Bombay, but they said no, they would rather go to Durban. And it was hijacking, and they all went to jail.
And he spent how many years in prison?
Well, Mike was sentenced to 10 years in prison, and ultimately he was freed in a presidential pardon after 33 months.
Okay, so the government was actually, the apartheid government was actually behind this. They actually supported it, but then denied it categorically.
That is correct. Yes. The exiles, the Seychellois exiles, needed more support than they had. So they approached the NIS and they introduced Mike to the SADF, who supplied all the weapons. The NIS came up with the plan, and Mike was told categorically the cabinet is aware of this and the Prime Minister himself is right behind it. Of course, the Prime Minister himself denied it, but the TRC found who was responsible. P.W. Botha, Magnus Milan, and a General van der Westhuizen.
Now, just to wrap up this interview, can you just tell me in a few words, how would you describe your father, his personality and him as a father?
Yeah. The word that always comes to mind is extraordinary, because he is on so many different levels, but that doesn't really tell you much. I also like the word dynamite, because he made things happen, and he was in a small package. He was 5'7" and of medium build. But above all, he was good-natured, polite. Yes, he was adventurous, but he was, as somebody once said, a proper British officer and gentleman, but there was a bit of pirate thrown in.
Chris Hoare, thank you so much for coming in and chatting to us about the biography on your father. The biography is called Mad Mike Hoare, The Legend. And that was it for this edition of Talking Books. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon.